Hi again, this is the third and last part of the revision video for the mid-semester 2. I've looked for a diagram that might be clear for the vestibular pathway in order to replace the older one, and I found this the best one available, the one that's the most clear, but the labeling is in French. So I would never ask you about the detailed labeling, but here you can see the semicircular canals. And then when the semicircular canals have their fluid inside moved because of the position of your body changed, then the receptors, the hair cells inside the the semicircular canals will be stimulated by the movement, and they will convert the mechanical energy into electrical energy, or they will transduce the mechanical energy into electrical energy. And then these electric impulses will pass along the vestibular nerve. And then the vestibular nerve will relay first in the vestibular nuclei. Notice that the vestibular nerve is the vestibular division of the eighth cranial nerve, or the vestibulocochlear nerve. These fibers of the vestibular nerve will relay first in the vestibular nuclei. Noyau vestibulaire, this is vestibular nuclei in the medulla oblongata and in the pons. And then from there, postsynaptic fibers or second-order neurons will go to the cerebellum. And then, as you can see, the cerebellum will send two types of fibers: ascending fibers to the thalamus and then to the cerebral cortex, and descending fibers, and this is important, to the spinal cord. So here you have the vestibulospinal tract. So these fibers descend from the cerebellum to the anti-gravity muscles to correct the position of the body, and they are called cerebellospinal fibers. So the cerebellospinal fibers are what? They are descending motor fibers that arise in the cerebellum and end in the spinal cord, and they give orders to the skeletal muscles to correct your position. This is a reflex that starts in the receptors, the hair cells in the semicircular canals, has its center in the cerebellum, and has its efferent pathway along the descending cerebellospinal fibers. And now we move on to the next slide, and we have finished talking about the sensory functions of the nervous system, or at least the part that is included in your curriculum. And now we move on to the motor functions of the nervous system. Of course, we have talked a lot before about the motor functions, but in this slide, we are trying to tell you that the motor functions of the nervous system can be categorized into three categories. The first one is to give an order to a muscle to move. The second one is the coordination of the voluntary muscles together. And the third one is the efferent pathway of the reflex action. So if you're ever asked about the motor functions of the nervous system in general, first of all, they're responsible for giving orders to the muscles to move. And this is done through descending motor nerves that connect the motor center in the frontal lobe of the brain to the skeletal muscles everywhere in the body. And this is what we called before the upper motor neurons. And then there is coordination of voluntary movements. Of course, as we know, coordination is done at different levels of the brain, but the main place where the main center where we have coordination of voluntary movements is the cerebellum, as we saw before. Of course, this is a diagram that shows you the sensory cortex, the somatosensory cortex. Behind it, we have the somatosensory association area. We have the primary motor cortex we're talking about in this slide. And then we have the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex is important for planning for the motor movements, that the complex motor movements that we are going to do in the future, in the very near future, and to coordinate them. So the primary motor cortex just gives orders to the muscles to contract, but what plans for these motor orders is the premotor cortex. And then, of course, you have the motor association area, which is responsible for coordination of voluntary motor action. And these are the descending motor pathways. As you can see, they descend from the frontal cortex, from the premotor cortex, descend through the internal capsule, and then they decassate at the level of the medulla. And yes, here is the medulla. So here we went through the midbrain, we went through the pons, we went through the medulla, and then they decassated to the opposite side, as we said before. So they project from the motor cortex, they cross over at the level of the medulla oblongata and form a structure called the pyramid. They synapse in the spinal cord, and then they project to the effector, which is the muscle. We talked about the reflex action before, and I've just explained in part 2 the components of the reflex action, starting from the receptor and ending by the effector. So here, the receptors, for example, are in the skin. This is the afferent motor neuron, the interneuron, the efferent motor neuron, and the effector organ. These are the components of the reflex action, but the components of the reflex action should also contain or include the center, which is the spinal cord. So again, we have a receptor, an afferent sensory neuron. We have an interneuron, an efferent motor neuron, and an effector organ. This part of the spinal nerve, where the motor and sensory, as you see, are very close to each other. Here you can better visualize how at the outer part or outside the central nervous system, we can see that both the sensory fiber and the motor fiber come very close to each other, and this is where they form the mixed spinal nerve. But as you approach the spinal cord or the center, you will have the afferent sensory alone and the efferent motor alone. The afferent sensory, all the afferent sensory fibers, because it's not only one fiber, will form the dorsal sensory root, and all the motor ones will form the ventral motor root. Here you can see the sensory ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion. It's like a swelling at the beginning of the dorsal sensory root, and this swelling results from the aggregation or grouping of the cell bodies of the sensory neuron. As you can see, this is the cell body of the sensory neuron, but it has a peripheral branch and a central branch. As we said before, most reflex actions that you already know and that you study frequently in the elementary and in the middle school have their centers in the spinal cord, but there are other centers that have other reflexes that have their centers in the brainstem or in the brain. Here, all the reflexes are from 1 to actually to 4 are spinal reflexes. When I say that the defecation reflex, the micturition reflex, the withdrawal reflex, and no, the pupillary reflex is not a spinal reflex. This has to be corrected. The pupillary reflex has its center in the brainstem. So the defecation reflex, the micturition reflex, and the withdrawal reflex are 3 examples of reflexes that have their level or center at the spinal cord, whereas they are controlled at the level of the brainstem. For example, the pupillary reflex. Therefore, we should remove that 3. Now, we know that the reflex starts by a receptor, but the receptor has to be stimulated, and therefore the stimulus is part of the components of the reflex action, and we have to add it to the components of the reflex action. How can we define a stimulus? A stimulus is a change in the external environment. or in the internal environment, actually. So a stimulus is a change in the internal or in the external environment, and actually it's a change in energy. So the touch stimulus, all these are external stimuli. So if I ever ask you about examples of external stimuli, you would mention these. You would mention these: touch, pressure, pain, cold, heat, light, sound. Actually, touch is a change in mechanical pressure. Pressure is a change in mechanical pressure. Pain is chemical energy because pain is associated with destruction of the cells. Cold and heat, this represents thermal energy. Light represents electromagnetic energy, and sound represents sound energy. Internal stimuli, the reflex might start from the inside of the body. For example, if there is lowering of the pH of the blood, there is reflex, increased rate of breathing. This is a reflex that starts by an internal stimulus, which is a lowered pH of the blood. Also, the changes in the levels of carbon dioxide, because they are associated with changes in pH. If you have a high level of carbon dioxide, you will have a more acidic pH or a lower pH. Similarly, blood levels of oxygen. And by the way, elevation of carbon dioxide is a more powerful and potent stimulant of the breathing rate than diminution of oxygen. And whenever you have an elevation of carbon dioxide, there are sensors in the blood vessels that are stimulated, receptors that are stimulated and send impulses to the medulla oblongata for reflex acceleration of the rate of breathing and the rate of the heart. This is a reflex. This is a reflex that has an internal stimulus that stimulates an internal receptor in the wall of the blood vessels, and whose center is not the spinal cord, but the medulla oblongata. You have here the rest of the internal stimuli, like a change in the diameter of the blood vessels, vasoconstriction, vasodilatation, diameter of the gut, constriction, relaxation, and so on. The last slide that is involved or included in the test are the memory functions. And of course, we talked about this several times. The frontal lobe is the center for the memory of habits and the memory of voluntary motor activities. The parietal lobe, specifically object names and recalling object names, and the temporal lobe, recognizing faces. And now I'll move on to the document, but I've added the document to the last slides so that I added the pictures to the last slide so that they wouldn't change the numbering or the sequence of the slides, to keep the numbers of the slides constant. So here we have the olfactory pathway, or the pathway of smell. You remember here, this is the roof of the nose. And in the previous diagram, we had a bone here that was called the ethmoid bone, ethmoid. And there were perforations for these sensory endings to pass. And that's why this perforated part is called the cribriform plate. And you needn't, of course, remember this, but if you write it in the test, if you ever have this question, then you will get a bonus, of course. These are the sensory receptors for olfactory stimuli, but here the whole cell acts as a receptor, not only the nerve ending. We call this the olfactory receptor, and this one the olfactory rod. And then there is this is the ethmoid bone, or the cribriform plate. This is the mucous membrane. I'm extremely sorry. I apologize deeply. Actually, this is the roof of the nose. We will start from the beginning again, and this is the roof of the nose, and this is the ethmoid bone, and these are the perforations in the ethmoid bone. and this perforated part is called the cribriform plate. The distance between the cribriform plate and the mucous membrane is not long. This is just the thickness of the mucous membrane. So the olfactory receptors are embedded in the mucous membrane. And actually, the body, the cell body of this neuron and these processes, the olfactory rods, are the receptors, and they are stimulated by chemical stimuli, which are the molecules of volatile substances or odoriferous substances that have a smell. And then these axons, the central axons of these cells will relay in the olfactory bulb, and then we will have the post synaptic neurons that will form a broad, flat tract that is called the olfactory tract, and the olfactory tract will move along the lower surface of the frontal lobe until it reaches the olfactory center on the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. The olfactory glomerulus is nothing but these synapses that exist between the olfactory receptors and the axons of the olfactory tract. Concerning the retina, as we said, this is the inside of the eye, and this is where light comes from. And these are the nerve cells in the retina. So the retina is nothing but a neural tissue. At the very far end of the retina, near the back of the eyeball, we have the rods and the cones. As you can see, the cones are conical in shape. Their ends is conical in shape, whereas the rods are cylindrical in shape, and both are sensory cells that transduce the light energy that falls on them into electric energy that will be carried by the optic nerve. How this occurs, light penetrates the thickness of the retina like this until it reaches the rods and the cones. As you can see, the rods and the cones are the farthest cells from the light stimulus in order not to be injured or burnt by the light. And then when light falls onto them, they are stimulated and they transduce light energy into electric energy. And then the electric impulses will relay with the bipolar cells. The bipolar cells are here to process the data that come from these rods and cones, which are photoreceptors actually. If I ever ask you why they are photoreceptors, you would say because they convert light energy into electric energy. And then the bipolar cells relay with the retinal ganglion cells. The retinal ganglion cells are very important because their axons form the optic nerve. So the optic nerve is nothing but the axons of the retinal ganglion cells. And as you know, the optic nerve, all the axons of the optic nerve will collect at the optic disc, leave the orbit in the skull via the optic canal, and then pass under the cerebral hemispheres and decassate, as you know, and they reach the occipital cortex. But as we said before, not all the fibers I'll show you the slide at the end, not all the fibers of the optic nerve decassate. Some of them decassate, others stay on the same side. And this is important, again, for each eye to be represented on both sides of the cerebral hemispheres, just in case injury occurs to part of the fibers, the individual would, or the patient wouldn't lose his eyesight. The auditory pathway has been explained before, starting at the cochlea and then the auditory nerve and ending in the auditory cortex. And as I said, if you ever mention the names of the nuclei, this would be a bonus for you. The vestibular pathway has just been explained, and this diagram just shows you the ear. This is the external ear, and then we have the middle ear. And in the middle ear, we have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. These names are not the ones we use. We say the malleus with a double L, incus, I-N-C-U-S, and the stapes. They vibrate and they transmit their vibration to the membrane in the cochlea, the oval window in the cochlea. And then the cochlea is the organ of hearing because it transduces sound into electric energy carried via the axons of the auditory nerve. Again, here you can see malleus, incus, and stapes. I'll just show you the optic nerve and then end the video. Excuse my voice, of course, because I'm fasting and I really find difficulty articulating the words. I have a very dry mouth, and I still have another video to make for grade 10. I'm looking for the pathway of the optic nerve. Yes. Here you can see that the retina is divided into a nasal part, which is closer to the nose on each side, the retina on each side, and a temporal part that is away from the middle line. The blue fibers, as you can see, will cross to the opposite side, whereas the red fibers will stay on the same side. So if you ever see something, the light rays that come from here and stimulate the temporal retina will be transmitted to the occipital cortex on the same side, whereas the other ones, the blue ones, will be transmitted to the other side. And the same applies here, so that the visual field is seen by both eyes, is represented in both visual cortices. And this is very important for binocular vision. Binocular vision means vision using both eyes. And another important thing is that if there is a damage to, for example, those fibers, then they can, to a certain extent, be substituted by the fibers on the other side. Thank you, guys. We've come to the end of the video and to the end of the slides that are included in the mid-semester test. And of course, I wish you the best of luck tomorrow, inshallah. And inshallah, I'm waiting for many full marks and above the full mark. Many of you are capable of doing this, inshallah, even all of you. Thank you, guys. Bye.